Cobra Kai has finished, and now I can finally settle the debate that most of you have been arguing in my comments for years. That debate being the Cobra Kai generation of fighters versus the Karate Kid generation. The old versus the new. How do they compare to one another? My POV on this topic has changed quite a lot if you've been on the channel before. I used to argue Karate Kid was much more powerful than the Cobra Kids, and then I argued that the Cobra Kids managed to skill gap the old generation by the time of seasons 1 and 2. And I've even noticed throughout the time of the show releasing a new season every year, there were comparisons between the old and new generation that always spiced this topic up more. And so I'm going to be going season by season and determine which specific season surpassed which specific Karate Kid movie and the relevant fighters that partake in these movies. So pretty much think of this video as like Karate Kid 1 Johnny, Karate Kid 2 Chozen, Karate Kid 3 Mike Barnes, and Karate Kid 3 Daniel versus the relevant kids of the Cobra Kai cast. Anywho, we can now get started with season 1, where I think it's pretty clear that Miguel and Robby, by the time they participate in their first All-Valley tournament, they both should be well above Karate Kid 1 Johnny and Daniel. Not only is Miguel able to utilize the same kick that knocked Johnny out, but he's able to also fight Robby, who has not only the knowledge of what Daniel learned in Karate Kid 1, but even has access to kata and the two-legged kick, a move that Daniel by the end of the trilogy didn't even have access to. Now, this argument is used to say that Robby should beat Karate Kid 3 Daniel because he's able to perform a move not even Daniel in his prime is able to do, but I still believe this Daniel to not only be physically stronger than Robby, with points that I'll get into a little later, but by the time of Karate Kid 3 he should have access to the things like the drum technique and a mastery of kata as well. But I do believe this is enough evidence to suggest that Miguel and Robby should definitely be above Daniel and Johnny. Miguel has pretty much Karate Kid 1 Daniel's best move under his belt, along with the teachings that Johnny had in Karate Kid, plus we see Robby, while he's focused with one arm, pretty much just not get hit once by the same Miguel. The only person that I think is the exception in all of this with the Karate Kid 1 scaling is Johnny Lawrence, and that's because during his fight with Daniel LaRusso, he was conflicted. Had Johnny not been tweaking out over a girl that didn't like him anymore, he more than likely would have had that fight in the bag. So I think you could make the case for Johnny being above Miguel at his prime, but I don't think it's enough to suggest that he's able to pretty much create the same gap that Robby managed to do while he's focused. So by the end, I do think Cobra Kai Season 1 is stronger than the peak Karate Kid 1 characters. At the very least, I think Miguel, Hawk, Aisha, and Robby should be able to defeat the Johnny and Daniel from specifically the first movie. I do think Hawk and Aisha as well should be at least able to contend with them, considering Aisha went 2-2 with Xander and Hawk was able to score a point on Robby. So by Season 1, I think the kids at least surpass the Karate Kid 1 era fighters bare minimum. However, going into the next few seasons, all I can say is that these guys are just even stronger and make the gap between them and Karate Kid 1 even bigger, but I can't say they close the gap that Karate Kid 2 makes, where we see the same technique that Daniel used in the last movie being completely ineffective. You see, threats like Chozen, and especially in Mike Barnes' case, make the gap much wider as Daniel progressively gets stronger throughout the films, and has to end up strong enough to contend and defeat these fighters. I do think by season 2 though, the gap is probably enough to say that the top tier kids surpass Karate Kid 1 completely, so unfortunately prime Johnny Lawrence gets left in the dust, but probably not Chozen, Mike, or Daniel in the second or third movie. I honestly believe that they don't really start contending with those characters until seasons 4 and 5. The reason for this is because this is where both dojos start learning the opposite style as one another, meaning they're gaining access to moves that Daniel in the second movie should have access to, like the drum technique. By this point, even fighters like Kenny can utilize the move, who at this point is like a mid-tier fighter for the Cobras. Sam and Miguel as well learn new techniques like the flying tornado kick, while Robby learns not only Kreese's Cobra Kai, but also Terry Silver's. So in terms of skill, I think the Cobra Kai kids should have the edge over the Karate Kids by a pretty good margin. However, there still is a gap in power that I don't think the Cobra Kids can deal with. In a tournament setting, these kids should be able to outskill Chozen Mike and Daniel by the end of the trilogy, but they probably would lose in a normal street setting due to the gap in power. It would go down in a similar fashion to when Johnny fought that MMA fighter. Sure, Johnny is much more skilled in a martial arts sense, but physically he can't get the drop on him. Why is there a plane flying over me when I'm recording? There is also the factor of Mike Barnes after Karate Kid 3 never training and somehow still being strong enough to be relative with Chozen in season 5. And I've seen people use this argument to suggest that Mike is closer to the adults in his prime, therefore he's stronger than the kids. But I think this argument is a little disingenuous. You'd have to pretty much assert that Mike Barnes in Karate Kid 3 and the one in Cobra Kai are relative with one another, which would pretty much negate everything that Daniel as an adult has been learning, as Daniel and Mike Barnes as kids, whether or not you think Mike Barnes should have won or not, it does not matter, they were at least comparable to one another, which would mean with this logic, adult Daniel should be relative to KK3 Daniel. But how does that make sense when we've seen Daniel get back into karate and shake off his rust since season 1? Along with learning new things like the Miyagi secrets that Chozen has dedicated his entire life to training to learn, and also Johnny's style of Cobra Kai. So no, I don't think adult Mike Barnes and young Mike Barnes are relative. Mike more than likely is less refined in karate as an adult, sure, but he never fell off like Johnny did and didn't become an alcoholic and never touched karate for the rest of his life. So he more than likely got stronger while becoming an adult. So think of Mike Barnes as a very, very rare case of grown man strength. Now that I dismissed the Mike argument, we can now move into season 6, where the kids are not only better than ever compared to their season 5 selves, but are about to face their greatest challenge yet, that being the sekai taikai. Mike Barnes, while preparing the top 6 students, said that all he ever wanted was to be in the sekai taikai, but he blew his chance. Now, this could mean one of two things. One, Mike was simply never skilled enough to enter and the Cobra Kids are, or 2, Mike was skilled enough but blew his chances due to the Karate Kid 3 incident. I believe option 2 is more than likely the case just because Mike looked at Daniel right before saying, but he blew it. Which implies to me, had he not done what he did, he could have been world champ material. This is consistent as well as the director of the show confirmed that Miguel still had 5 more episodes before surpassing the Daniel that defeated Mike Barnes. Which means part 1 and 2 of the season 6 crew more than likely have not surpassed Mike and Daniel yet. But they are pretty much right next to them due to everything they've learned up to this point. And I will say for the Tory point, she struggled so much to break the stone because she didn't believe in herself, and past this point in season 5 she has gotten a lot more powerful. So I do think the argument could be made for the season 6 cast to be strong enough to deal with Chozen and Daniel, but based off the director's statement, it's clear that they are not at the Karate Kid 3 level yet. However, I think Mike Barnes and Daniel get completely power crept by the end of part 3, and the reason for this being is Drago Jr., aka Axel. Axel was someone who was stronger than roid-taking children and was capable of drawing blood on Robby, the same Robby who by this point is the undisputed #1 fighter of the season 6 crew. Robby would then proceed to cliff his part 2 self and manage to actually fight on Axel's level, and mind you, this Axel is not only stronger because he was training in prep for the second part of the tournament, but he's also enraged. And this Axel was honestly fighting worse than Robby before he specifically broke his leg to win the fight. Miguel would then proceed to surpass this version of Robby and fight better against Axel and would manage to actually defeat him on his own. And I think this gap that they closed on Axel would mean that they're not only the best in the world, but now they are definitively above the old generation. I'd say the strongest argument you can make for Daniel and Mike Barnes or the Karate Kid generation of fighters is that they would be on the level of the season 6 crew going into the tournament, but I doubt they are on the level of the main 5 students. That is the best argument I can probably make for the two, as we know that Hawk is still comparable to Miguel and Robby, and Sam and Tory, who were never that far off from those two, train and grow throughout the tournament, especially Tory. And despite that, she could still never close the gap that Miguel and Robby made after prepping for Axel in part 3. And to sum this video up, if you were to get the main Karate Kid fighters with the main Cobra Kai crew by the end of season 6, not only is the gap in power made up due to Robby and Miguel closing the gap on Axel, but the Cobra Kai generation of fighters have access to literally everything that the Karate Kid generation of fighters do, plus more. I hope you guys think I did a good job comparing the old with the new, and let me know down below what Cobra Kai related versus battles you would like me to cover next.